Hi. So a quick intro from me as well. So my name's Caroline Hickman. I have known Katie a few years now and absolutely love this project and meeting you and working with you. I live in Wiltshire. I work in Bath and Bristol, but since COVID, I moved pretty much all of my psychotherapy work online and on the phone, which has worked out quite well in lots of ways, because suddenly, before COVID, I was working in Bath and Bristol and Devizes. Now I've got people that I'm working with as a therapist all over the world, in America, Canada, Alaska, London, everywhere. And I think there's something different and freeing about working in that way. So we lose something, but you gain something. I live on my own in a cottage in Wiltshire, but not quite on my own because I have a 9-month-old puppy called Wilfred, who is out for a walk or asleep in my neighbor's house. I'm a psychotherapist and I'm a depth psychologist, and I'll explain more about that as we go. But it basically means that we want to look under the surface. We want to go down into the depths of things. And we very much want to work with what's not always immediately visible and apparent, not conscious. So this is using a psychological framework, which if you've seen the Pixar film Inside Out, with joy and anger, because she goes down into the unconscious and you see the scale of the unconscious. We're human beings. Our egos like to think that we're in control. We're roughly 5% conscious and in control, roughly. We're roughly 95% out of awareness, out of consciousness. If we were completely conscious creatures, there would be no war, there would be no racism, there would be no homophobia. We don't need those things. They don't enhance our lives. They're not logical. They become a form of perverted logic, but that's because of an unconscious drive. My psychotherapy practice is about 60% working with people with distress and anxiety and depression around climate change and the biodiversity crisis. And the other part of my psychotherapy practice is the rest of life, which causes us stress, working with children, teenagers, adults, and couples. I also teach at the University of Bath, and I teach social work there. So that's relevant in the social justice side of things. So we'll come to that more in a minute. What else do you need to know about me? I had a fabulous midlife crisis when I hit 40, and I ran away to Egypt to be a diving instructor and spent 2 years underwater. The only time I pretty much stop work and thinking is when I'm underwater, because there's no phones and I get to hang out with fish and reefs. And that brings me into personal conflict with flying and carbon emissions. And COVID took that problem away from me for a few years. Before COVID, I had done a deal with myself that I would have 1 flight a year. And I would fit into that a mixture of doing some work, doing some research, doing some therapy work, and spending as much time underwater with sharks as I could possibly fit in to 1 flight a year. Not been anywhere for 3 years because of COVID. And I don't know what I'm going to do with that in the future. But that's how I'm navigating that. I think that's enough of an introduction. The first session is going down into dealing with the difficult truths of climate psychology, climate anxiety, climate depression, climate grief. So stick with me, because there will be moments in this first part where you will, I assume if you're normal, have little voices in your head going, why am I here? Why won't she shut up? Please stop talking. This is awful. You're just bringing us down. That would make perfect sense. Stick with the process, because we're going to go down and we're going to face some of the difficulties and the reality of what we're dealing with the psychological impact of climate change in that first part. And I also need to apologize a little bit because I'm just going to deliver it to you. And there's a lot to fit in. The second part, we're going to reframe that in a much more positive way. So I'm going to bring you out from the depths. And then in the third part, we're going to say, okay, well, now what? What can we do? You will see me get twitchy around language, like how do we manage these feelings? How do we control these feelings? How do we deal with these feelings? Because I will be taking an attitude of good luck with that, because it's a bit like trying to herd cats. It's a bit like locking a bunch of puppies in a room for a day and then opening the door and expecting them to behave themselves. Emotions have their own way of communicating and expressing themselves. And I think humans have a lot of trouble when we try to control emotion and control feelings, because feelings have their own way of communicating, which is completely different. So bear with me on that one. The other thing, so I'm trying to give you a few initial commentaries before we go down. It's a bit like giving you some sustenance to take with you on that journey down. The other thing is my view of resilience, which is, somebody asked me a few years ago, how do you get emotional resilience? And I said, well, I'm really sorry, but you have to fail. You have to fail miserably, dismally, and then get back up and have another go. And then you have to hit the wall. And then you have to be hopeless and helpless, and sometimes hate yourself or hate the world or both, and then get back up and have another go. And that journey of movement between those things, between getting back up and having another go and learning from the collapse or the failure, that's how we build resilience. Resilience cannot be built without failure, hopelessness, despair, anger, frustration, and struggle. And the more struggle and the more we suffer alongside that struggle, but not too much suffering, but just enough, the more we can build resilience. So that's the second note. The third one is, before I start talking about eco-anxiety and despair, I want to be very clear about the way I perceive it, the way I understand it. So I've been working in mental health, psychology, psychotherapy for 40 years. So you might want to think that I kind of know what I'm talking about. I'd like to think that I know what I'm talking about. I was a mental health social worker. I worked in frontline mental health social work and in the community and in hospitals. I've worked as a counselor, worked as a psychotherapist, worked with thousands of people. And I teach a lot of this stuff. And I'm going to be really clear. I don't think we really fully understand what climate anxiety is about. And I don't think we should have the arrogance of thinking that we fully understand this. So it is an emergent mental health problem, which means it is emerging, it is developing, it is changing, it is growing as we live with it. So we're living with it and studying it and experiencing it all at the same time. And we can't fully understand it unless we also recognize and acknowledge and feel it within ourselves. I wouldn't want anybody to take away my eco-anxiety. That's the last thing I would want. So in that respect, this is not a mental illness to be pathologized or fixed or got rid of. It is absolutely something which is congruent and emotionally, mentally healthy in relation to the reality, the external reality of what's going on in the world. In fact, I would worry about people that weren't feeling it. I don't want people to take it away from me. I also don't want to be overwhelmed by it to the point where I can't function. But I absolutely would fight anybody who tried to fix me like I'm a broken machine or take it away, because it's my anxiety and my despair and my distress which helps me empathize with other people, which helps me empathize with the young people who I work with in Nigeria, in the Maldives, in India, in the UK, in America. It's what helps me develop compassion and empathy. And I can't know exactly what it's like for them, but I can try. And it's that emotional connection with it, which gives me depth and gives me understanding. I also think we only struggle with eco-anxiety or eco-distress because we care. And so why would we want to tell people that they shouldn't care, right? This is logic. We should be celebrating the fact we care. We should be celebrating the fact that we care not just about our own futures and the futures of younger generations and children and other people around the world. And we care what's happening to the planet. So we shouldn't be saying there's something wrong with this. We should be saying, why don't people care? Why don't other people care? So hopefully you can understand why the last thing I would want is for this to be taken away or turned into something else. So I just wanted to start with that because it's now going to get a bit heavy. And I've heard from Katie, and I know her projects and how she works, that there's a lot of care in your group already. But if you're feeling upset, or if you're feeling angry, or you're feeling frustrated about any of what I'm saying, that's okay. And you're not alone. Don't take them away. Don't be embarrassed. Don't be ashamed. All feelings are very welcome here. All thoughts are welcome here. We wouldn't want to exclude anything at all. Nothing to be ashamed of. So this is a journey, eco-anxiety to eco-empathy and eco-aliveness, and facing these difficult truths. What does it mean to face these difficult truths? And you'll notice we've used the word face rather than deal with or tackle or manage. You will get used to the fact that I don't really like that language, because it's partly that attitude from humanity that has got us into this mess in the first place. That arrogance, the argument that humanity is superior to all other species, all other beings, that has led us to not take care of the world that we're living in. So this gives us scale, it gives us perspective. And I promise you, I'm not knocking COVID. I'm not minimizing it. I've had COVID 3 times now, and I have long COVID. So I'm still dealing with symptoms. I'm okay, but it has affected my life. But COVID is nothing compared to climate change and the biodiversity crisis. And technically, we should be putting COVID into the biodiversity crisis wave, because it is the failure to take care of biodiversity, the failure to take care of the way that disease and health problems can jump from animals to people, which has led us to struggle with COVID. And COVID was not the first. Before COVID, we had SARS, we had MERS, we had Zika, we had HIV. But a lot of those diseases stopped at the gates of Europe. But other parts of the world have been dealing with these epidemics and pandemics for a long time. COVID this time made it across Europe and North America. So it's perceived differently. And it's more transmissible in many ways. But there are similarities. The reason I'm saying that is we're going to be talking in a minute about the importance of reparation, the importance of healing our relationship with the other, which is relationship with nature. And you're going to get a little bit of humor from me periodically. Humor is a mature defense, as long as it's not used to dismiss the importance and the seriousness of what we're dealing with. But humor can also communicate through defenses. So it can be really useful when you're talking with people who are highly defended around what we're talking about here, which is scary stuff, basically. And she's saying to him, can you give me a hand moving these from the fiction to the non-fiction section, which is 1984, The Handmaid's Tale, Clockwork Orange, The Trial, Hunger Games, The Road, Planet of the Apes. Because a lot of what we're facing in the world has been predicted and communicated about, and of course we should have the Don't Look Up film in there. Hollywood has been talking about this for a long time. But particularly in the West and the Western mindset, this is distanced and this is future and this is dystopia. And this is not something that is affecting us here and now today. And of course, each year as this goes on, that is changing. And if you have a global mindset, a global empathy, a global understanding, you will understand that what's happening elsewhere around the world is impacting on us, and we should feel guilty and responsible and say sorry because we're culpable. So it is a systemic problem. We can't afford, and I'm sure you're fully aware of this, we can't afford to sit in the UK or anywhere else and think, oh, well, we'll be all right. Apart from the fact that that's just immoral, it's also not true. When people feel absolutely overwhelmed with the anxiety, thankfully, not that many people feel that much overwhelm. But we have to pay attention to the fact that some do. And we have to keep in mind that for some people, adults as well as young people, it can be unbearable. And they can struggle to know how to live. A 19-year-old said to me a few years ago, he said, tell me, he said, why should I want to live in a world that doesn't care? It doesn't care about the future of young people. Why? So one thing you're going to hear from me repeatedly is that climate anxiety is absolutely nothing purely to do with environmental problems. It's relational problems. And it's that relational betrayal. And it's the fact that everyone around you, half the time, you can feel like you're going mad because you're standing there and you're really worrying and nobody else seems to be worrying. If everybody was worrying to the same extent, that would be reassuring and everyone would be taking action. I get a little bit frustrated with this phrase of the cure for eco-anxiety is eco-activism, because A, it doesn't need to be cured, it's not a mental illness, and B, activism is important, but it is not enough on its own. We need the emotional response alongside this. Otherwise, you run the risk of going out there being heroically activist. We're going to deal with this. We're going to fix it. We're going to do everything. And then collapsing, crashing and burning. Because you're surrounded by people in power who are not taking action. Governments, oil companies, other big businesses, who are not only not taking action, they are frequently taking the opposite of what needs to be done in order to deal with climate change and the biodiversity crisis. And that is really hard to figure out and understand. We'll talk more about this later. So this young woman was not only happy for me to use her quote, she was relieved. And this gives me an opportunity to make another point, which is this is not an individual problem. It is not a singular problem. This is a collective issue. So we should not be left dealing with it on our own. We need connection. We need community. We need groups. So she's huge. She's very isolated in her world. Her whole family are, I hate using his name, but I will, Trump voters. Many of them don't even believe that climate anxiety even exists. So she's got the relational pain as well as that betrayal, as well as thinking that, frankly, they've lost the plot. So she's relieved that I'm using her words to share in these kind of discussions, because it helps her not feel quite so alone. some years ago, Gus Speth used to be the US advisor on climate change. He's a scientist. He said, I used to think top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. And with 30 years good science, we could address those problems. But I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And scientists don't know how to do that. Now, what you will see nowadays is more and more scientists speaking out about this. Scientists getting arrested, scientists for Extinction Rebellion, Peter Kalmus in the United States, brilliant scientists here in the UK, recognizing that we can't just have a technological fix. We can't just have a scientific, practical fix to this, because we need relational change, cultural change, environmental justice change, because this is a systemic problem. So why psychology? Hopefully I'm framing it for you as we go. Part of the reason we need climate psychology is because we are being pushed down paths that we've never been down before. Humanity has never faced a problem like climate change before. We've faced many, many problems. We've faced wars, tsunamis, pandemics, epidemics, and we have resilience from dealing with these things. Problem is, one of the things we use psychologically to help us deal with those things is that reassurance that when we get beyond this, when we get over this, when we learn to deal with this, everything will be all right. This is one of the worst things I'm going to be saying to you today, which is, I'm really sorry, but there's already so much carbon in the atmosphere that we can't use that reassurance for ourselves. Even if we went to zero carbon emissions tomorrow, it's too late. We're halfway through the story of climate change. We can't go back to the beginning. So when we talk about climate psychology, it means facing these painful truths, looking at what's underneath. And some of this could be triggering what I'm saying to you. So just breathe if it's triggering. You might be feeling some relief hearing me say this, but you might be also wishing that what I was saying wasn't real. It wasn't true. I wish it wasn't true. I really do. But there is something powerful about looking at this reality. This gives us opportunities for transformation. And when we're talking about transformational change, we'll talk about this more in the third discussion today. Transformational change involves painful struggle, but it also means that it gives us the resilience, the resources, the capacity to face levels of change that we never thought we knew how to deal with. And there's some comfort in that. So it's a paradoxical comfort that I'm giving you. It's a radical hope approach, which is things are bad, things are awful. We need to face that reality. And there's a lot we can do. Weirdly, human egos and brains try to get back in control. We don't like being out of control. And one of the ways we try to get back in control is go, oh, it'll be all right. Technology will solve this. We can fix it. We can do this. We can do that. Recycling, you know, all these things. They're all good. It's all true. And it's not enough, right? Weirdly, the opposite is also true. Nihilism, doom and gloom, hopelessness, apocalyptic thinking, catastrophic thinking. It's useless, it's hopeless, what's the point? That is also, psychologically, us trying to get back in control. So we're either in control by fixing everything or by destroying everything. And that makes us feel secure. Neither of those are true. It is not apocalyptic. It is not hopeless, but also it is not going to all be okay. So we need to understand that those are the ways the ego tries to get back in control because we don't like being out of control. What we need to be able to do is stand in the middle and tolerate the uncertainties and the tension that we feel in the middle, which is both and rather than either or. It's both awful and there's a lot we can do. It's not either awful or okay. Hopefully that feels clear. If you're not sure about that, let's talk about that later. This is the model we're using. We're talking about the unconscious mind, which is an awful lot bigger than the conscious mind. And as anxieties or fears get triggered, they start to move into consciousness. But the subconscious mind goes into alert mode and says, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute, this is scary, get back. And all of our defenses will kick off. Denial, displacement, disavowal. We'll talk more about the details of these in a minute. But it protects us from things that are overwhelming. The problem is it also means that we don't deal with reality. So this is why we need the reality of the situation we're in. And we need to breathe through this and be able to tolerate this reality. This is Freud was the originator of this kind of way of thinking. Jung followed him as a psychologist, and Jung brought in this idea of the collective unconscious, which is a consciousness that globally we all share. We all swim in this collective unconscious sea. So this makes sense in terms of what I was talking about a minute ago about the global empathy that is needed in order to have this transformative change. We'll talk more about these things in a moment. Paul Hoggart set up the Climate Psychology Alliance. He said, we're living in this time when a tragedy which is without precedent is unfolding in front of our eyes. Like I said, we don't really know how to deal with this. We're finding out. We're witnessing catastrophic rates of species extinction, biodiversity loss, soil and ocean exhaustion, runaway climate change. So it's clear. We have record heat waves, melting ice, and this will potentially lead to huge impact on infrastructure, resource disruption. Young people who I'm talking with in Portugal who are dealing with fires, young people in the Philippines and the Maldives are dealing with flooding. This impacts practically as well as emotionally. We'll talk more about that in a moment. The research that we're doing shows that distress in relation to climate change is a long-term stressor. So although the anxiety may come up and then go down and then come up and then go down, it actually is acting under the surface throughout our lives. Just because it's not in conscious awareness doesn't mean it's not affecting us. And we can have vicarious trauma, hearing about other people's stories. We can have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, following fires or floods. And we also have complicated grief. It's not straightforward grief. So this is the profound mental health impact. I've been really clear about this, I think. Eco-anxiety is a healthy response emotionally, but it is not just about the environmental problems, it's powerfully linked to the failure of adults, the failure of people in power to act. We measure mental health by looking at people's capacity to respond to external reality. So you could argue it is mentally unhealthy for people to not act. When people do the cure for eco-anxiety is eco-activism, my response is actually the cure for eco-anxiety and reducing it in young people is increasing it in government ministers. If they were more anxious, we might get a bigger response. So what do we mean by eco-anxiety? Well, actually, this is what I mean. These are all emotionally healthy responses. Grief, solastalgia, which is grief for the loss of a particular place. Hope and hopelessness. We need to feel both. A friend of mine who's an ecologist laughs at me because I call this emotional biodiversity. She says, yeah, this is not quite what biodiversity means. I don't care. I think it helps explain what I mean by we need this range of emotion. All of these have their place. We need to feel blame, frustration, guilt, shame, sadness, grief. It's okay to have fantasies of rescue. It's okay to have apocalyptic fantasies. The trick is not to get stuck in those fantasies. Let yourself imagine them, feel them, and then return back to the center. It's okay to have these defenses of avoidance, denial, delay, disavow. The trick is to consciously know that that's where you're going and bring yourself back. It's okay to feel some nihilism and despair. Don't get stuck in it. Don't live in it. It's okay to feel it. This is what I mean by internal activism. Of course, we need external activism in the world, but we need this emotional range. We need to build this emotional resilience. This is emotional activism. The latest IPCC report was the very first one that talked about the mental health impact of climate change. And then you've got other devastating stuff. UNICEF report from last year talks about the physical health impact, particularly on children and young people, but also the mental health impact. And the reason it's worse for young people and children is because this is exposure to chronic stress in childhood, which means there is an increased risk in developing mental health problems in adolescence and adulthood. It sucks. It's not fair. And we adults are responsible for this, and we have a duty of care, and we are failing. This is the scale around climate anxiety I've been trying to develop, from the mild to the medium to the critical. When we have mild eco-anxiety, our feelings of upset are transient, and we can be reassured. We can respond to reassurance from other people, and we have a focus on optimism and hope. But as we become more severely anxious and distressed, we lose doubt, we lose hope in other people's capacity to take action. And we make more changes in our life. This is what we've got to navigate, is this tension. We need to feel enough stress and distress and anxiety to take action, but not so much that we're completely overwhelmed all the time. Or we need to have the capacity to move between these emotional states. As it gets worse, we feel more guilt, we feel more shame, less faith in others' ability to take action. It starts to have more impact on your relationships, because you think, well, why aren't you worried like me? So you feel isolated and alone. And then it gets worse. People can have intrusive thoughts where you just can't think about anything else. Your sleep is affected. There's no respite, no rest. There's an anticipation of human extinction, no belief in others' ability to care. You may not be able to go to school or go to work. And at its absolute worst, I am working with young people and adults who can feel suicidal, not because they want to die, but because they don't know how to live in this world where they're so overwhelmed with terror, so isolated, and they feel that people don't care. That loss of personal security is severe. Nobody should be left feeling that way. I don't want to sound arrogant, but I do want to be reassuring, which is what I've found so far is that through a process of climate aware therapy, everybody who I've been working with who has been that critical and in that much pain is in recovery and is now able to cope and tolerate and navigate. And they haven't lost the significance and the seriousness of how they're feeling, but they've got an ability to emotionally regulate, to be okay. I did a webinar in the Philippines back in December, and I'll show you some of the Philippines figures in a second. And I sat there the night before looking at these figures thinking, how am I going to do this? Turn up at this webinar as this white woman, privileged in the West, and give you these devastating figures. How are we going to do this? And I just thought, well, I don't know, really. I just need to say sorry quite a lot. So I did. I said sorry a lot. And they opened the webinar with this brilliant question, which is it okay to not be okay about the climate crisis? And we all said, yeah, it's okay to not be okay. But we need to be okay with not being okay. And we need to find ways to be okay within our not okayness. British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy did this survey, and they found 55% of young people, of all people, were feeling affected. But look at this age difference. I think this is interesting. 61% of 16 to 24-year-olds, that demographic, that group, feel the most concerned. And then it kind of reduces to the 45 to 54-year-old age group. Now, this is quant research. They didn't ask why. And then it starts to go up again in the over 65s. I'm speculating. It's possible that that middle age group are just so overwhelmed with paying the mortgage, paying the rent, taking care of relatives, taking care of children, holding on to their job, dealing with social pressures, that everything they're worrying about is just a bit overwhelming. That's possible, but it's speculation. The Royal College of Psychiatrists reported over half of child and adolescent psychiatrists are now seeing children and young people distressed about climate crisis, reporting low mood, helplessness, anger, loss of sleep, panic, and guilt. So this is the quant research that we published last year. This was 10,000 children and young people, 16 to 25 in these different countries: Australia, Brazil, Finland, France, India, Nigeria, Philippines, Portugal, UK, and the US. And we asked, how is climate change affecting you emotionally? How is it affecting your thinking? And how is it affecting your daily functioning? And if you look at this graph, this is daily functioning, the dark blue line, and you can see the difference. The emotional impact is very similar when it comes to the UK or India or Nigeria or the Philippines. It's not massively different. So young people in the UK are feeling anxious. Philippines is by far the worst, but look at the blue line, impact on daily functioning. India, Philippines, 74%. UK, only 28%. US, 26%. But we will move in that direction. If you look at countries like Brazil, it's 50%. So they are not as bad as the Philippines, but they are worse than us. That's the trajectory. That's where we're going to see this going. And this is how climate change makes 16 to 25-year-olds feel: sad, afraid, anxious. But it wasn't just about emotion, it's also about the cognition. How does it affect the way you think? And this is where I think it's really important to give you a few of these numbers. 55% worldwide, which is a summary of all of those countries. 53% UK think they won't have access to the same opportunities their parents had. This is where it's different. Security is not threatened directly at the moment in the UK. It was only 39% in the UK, 52% worldwide. People have failed to take care of the planet. This is where, doesn't matter where you live, young people are perceiving this in a similar way. 83% worldwide, 80% UK, 92% Philippines. You can understand why I said sorry after each of these now. 3/4 or more think the future is frightening. 75% worldwide, 73% UK, 92% Philippines. This is the statistic that worried people the most. Over half of these young people think humanity is doomed. 56% worldwide, 51% UK, 73% Philippines. I'm going to talk more about this in the second part. I personally find this reassuring, because I think if we can face the worst of this message, then we might take action. For me, all of that is pretty awful, but this is the worst. 48% of children and young people reported they were dismissed or ignored by other people when they tried to talk about climate change. Worldwide and in the UK, this was 48%. Now, we could change this afternoon. We can change this today. We should not be dismissing children and young people. We shouldn't be dismissing anybody, especially not children and young people, when they try and talk about things that concern them, whether it's their mental health, whether it's their eating, whether it's their self-harm, whether it's their relationships, or whether it's climate change. This is on us. We should not be dismissing anybody when they try to talk about what concerns them. And then we linked it to government action or inaction, because it's important. This is the relational bit. And you can see that children and young people, only 27% thought governments were taking their concerns seriously. 65% thought governments were failing young people. Climate change, climate anxiety is personal, it is relational, but it is also political as well as planetary. And climate psychology needs to teach us how to span all of those things. So this research is activism. It is political activism, psychological activism. This is my hope, to turn psychology into protest. So yes, young people can be left feeling abandoned, afraid, anguished, but it's not all hopeless. There can be reassurance. Young people can feel valued and hopeful if we listen to them. And that's it. That's the first part done.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm Katie Hodgetts from the Resilience Project, and I'm here with Caroline, the amazing Caroline Hickman. Thank you for being here. And you have all hopefully just had a bit of a break after session one. And in session one with Caroline, I think to summarize, we heard a really stark reminder of the emergency that we're facing. And I think for me, especially, I know that sometimes I can kind of close my eyes and ears to the reality because I feel like sometimes it impedes me from doing activism when I have to feel stuff. So I wondered if we could just start, Caroline, by maybe naming some of the emotions and feelings that people might be re-entering this space, feeling and holding after part one.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the first thing to say is don't be surprised at any of the feelings that emerge, because there's a whole range of feelings involved in responding. Eco-anxiety itself is a bit of an unhelpful term because it suggests that we would just feel anxious. And actually, anxiety can often be the first thing we feel because it's a trigger there's a threat, it's like warning, watch out, be careful. So we're going to feel anxious. Then we're going to look for what is it that's making us anxious. Whereas actually anxiety is a kind of continuous state, if I'm honest, in the world today. There's lots to be anxious about. And that anxiety can often then open other doors to depression, despair, frustration, anger, hopelessness, grief, rage, shame, guilt, grief. I think I've covered most of them. And none of them should be that surprising to you. The important thing is not to live in those emotional states all the time, to feel them, to visit them, to navigate back out of them to a place of relative calm, but to know where they are so that you can visit them and you can connect with them, but don't stay in them too long. If you get overwhelmed by one of them, then that's when life gets really difficult. So that range of emotions makes absolute sense. And I talk about this and she laughs at me, my friend who's an ecologist. I talk about this as an emotional biodiversity, and she says that's not quite what biodiversity is like, but I still think it's a useful way to think about this. So in the way that we need that biodiversity environmentally and ecologically, it makes sense that we need insects, we need fish, we need soil, we need air, we need heat, we need water, we need light, we need darkness, we need winter, we need summer. Think about emotions in a similar way. You actually need all of those emotions, but you don't want too much of one of them or another one. You need to keep that relationship between the emotions alive as well. One of the difficulties we've got, when I did my psychotherapy training, we were taught that it's often the feelings about the feelings that are the problem. And the feelings about the feelings are often what causes us some of the greatest difficulty. So we feel anxiety or we feel depression. And then we immediately go to judge those feelings and think, why am I anxious? I shouldn't be so anxious. And then you get anxious about being anxious, or you get depressed about being depressed, or you get angry about being depressed, or you judge yourself for feeling depressed or anxious and start saying, there's something wrong with me, or there's something wrong with you. You're making, and then we can defend even more and start saying, you're making me feel this way, because we simply don't know how to cope with those feelings, especially if they're unfamiliar, and especially if you've not really met them before. So it's often the feelings about the feelings. The feelings themselves, they're not going to destroy you, but although it can feel as if they do, particularly panic and anxiety, can be really hard to tolerate and cope with, but they're not going to kill you. But the reaction we get to them can often be even more alarming if we feel panic or if we feel rage or if those feelings lead us to feel disconnected from ourselves and other people. And
Mm.
we can then go into a kind of retreat, a kind of shutdown where we don't feel anything, because it's not that we don't feel anything, it's that we're feeling too much. So one of the ways to cope with that is to shut down, and then you're disconnected, and then you've got this kind of surreal experience of feeling disconnected, or at its strongest dissociated, where you're almost not feeling anything at all, which is a defense. It's a way of coping with extreme emotion and extreme trauma. The thing about defenses is they help us survive in the short term, so they're really useful. But
Mm.
if we continue to use them in the longer term as a coping strategy, then they have the opposite effect. They actually are unhelpful to us, because then what happens, for example, if we get very disconnected emotionally, what happens is it's like a dam being breached. When the emotions come back, we then can be flooded. So you've got the extreme opposites of too little or too much feeling. So the trick is to stay in connection with the feelings, keep them in view, know where they are, but not be overwhelmed or completely disconnected. To try and inhabit a space where you can make relationship with them. And the example we've used in the past a lot, Katie, is the bus, the idea of the
Mm.
bus, where think of yourself as a bus, and every seat on the bus is populated by a different part of yourself. So on one seat, you can have your anger, another seat, you've got your anxiety, another seat, you've got your depression, another seat, you've got your despair. And then think of ourselves in parts rather than a single. So on another seat, you've got the baby self, another seat, you've got the 10-year-old, and another seat, you've got the teenager. And on another seat, you've got the rebellious teenager. We've got to have them on the bus. On another seat, you've got the poor me, please won't someone just make all this awful stuff go away part of yourself. It can be tempting to get over identified with one part of ourselves, like the heroic part of ourselves, or the depressed part of ourselves, or the I can fix this strong part of yourself. We need
Mm.
all of these parts, but you don't want to over identify with any one of them. So what you need to do is make space for all of these parts of yourself to stay on the bus.
Mm.
Just depends who's got hold of the steering wheel. And if the depressed part of you has got hold of the steering wheel for too long, you need other parts of you to kind of step in and go, okay, you can take a back seat for a bit.
Mm.
The Western medical model is really unhelpful to us because we've grown up not even realizing we're living in the Western medical model. I'm going to show you a picture that I think shows this so beautifully and helps us think about what it means to live in a state that we don't even know is there. This is what it means to live in the Western medical model, is we don't realize, we can't see it because we're in it in the same way as these fish are in the water and they're saying, I don't see the water. Well, we're living in the Western medical model and we don't see it because it's normal to us. But it's actually not normal to the vast majority of people in the world. The Western medical model says it's wrong to be depressed, it's wrong to be anxious, it's wrong to have strong emotional states that can't be understood or rationalized or managed. And we should then treat them like we treat physical health problems, i.e., take a pill or use a form of therapy that gets rid of them and makes you feel okay again. This is a real problem to us. for all sorts of reasons. But one of the reasons this is problematic with the climate crisis is, as we already discussed earlier, it makes perfect sense to not feel okay about this situation that we're living in. I would worry about people that didn't feel anxious or didn't feel depressed or didn't feel angry about it, because we measure mental health by looking at our ability to relate to external reality. And external reality says the world is a problem, and the climate is a problem, and the floods and the wildfires and the ice melting. We should be worried about these things. Therefore, feeling anxious and feeling depressed is a mentally healthy response. So the Western medical model, which says get rid of these feelings, actually can make us feel worse, because we can't get rid of the climate crisis. We have to learn to live in it like the fish live in water. We have to relate to it.
And maybe we can just say that again for people who are watching, because I'm sure people might be sat in their circle thinking, I came here to have my eco-anxiety fixed, cured. I wanted to go. It doesn't feel good. Like, we all know how that feels. And
Absolutely.
I think we would all want to not feel that way. So, you know, you've said to me before about wearing my eco-anxiety as a badge of honor. Can you say more about that a bit for everyone?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say this, and I don't want you to think, oh, it's okay for her, or she's got it sussed, or, because this is an ongoing process of learning for all of us. And so I'm sharing with you my knowledge and my learning based on years of working in mental health and years of working as a psychotherapist and trying to understand the climate crisis, particularly from young people's points of view, for the last 10 years. And I don't think we yet know everything we need to know about this. So we're still learning. I think it's crucial to understand that this is not just caused by emotion, it's caused by relational difficulties. So, two things. One, if you feel eco-anxiety or despair or depression, it's not just anxiety or frustration or rage. Those feelings are uncomfortable, and I can totally understand that you want to get rid of those feelings. We always want to get rid of uncomfortable feelings. We want to go back to a state of peacefulness. We want to go back to a state of peacefulness and equilibrium and calm. That's fine. Problem is the environment is going to constantly be causing us to feel disrupted, dysregulated, emotionally distressed, confused, despair, anxious. So it's natural to feel all of these things. And you're only feeling them because you're alive and you're awake and you care and you have empathy and you're knowledgeable. You're only feeling these things because of that. One of the ways that people manage their feelings is by denial, shutting down, disavowal, disbelief, saying, oh, it's not that bad, by focusing on, other stuff in the world. That's partly how they manage those feelings. But actually, if you're feeling this distress, I would want you to try and reframe it and say to yourself, well, you're feeling this because you care. And you should feel proud that you care. We should be celebrating that we care, not saying stop caring. If the only way to get rid of my anxiety is to stop caring, I don't want to get rid of my anxiety. So there has to be another way. The other way is to understand the anxiety, to understand the distress, to not feel alone with it, to feel understood by others, and to make sense of it in the context of the world in which we're living today. So the anxiety is the price you pay for caring. It's the price you pay for being alive, for being awake, for being concerned about what's happening to our planet.
Mm.
So it's planetary care and concern, as well as personal care and concern, as well as social and political and justice care and concern. And you're not going to get away with not feeling stuff in relation to this. So I totally understand that you want help with the feelings, but trying to get rid of them will actually make things worse.
Well, it's like the bus, right? If
Like,
I kick off depression from the bus and I
yeah,
say, don't fancy that one today, what happens?
what
Can I
happened?
just do that? Can I just close the doors and lock them?
You can lock the doors and you can drive away, and you can even convince yourself that depression is a badly behaved thing that shouldn't be on the bus. Let's kick off. This is our approach to problematic people in the world. We'll just exclude them. We'll
Mm,
just get rid of them, right? This is what they do in schools when a child is, not fitting into the norms of the school. We'll exclude them, right?
mm,
Easy, sorted, right? Not really sorted, because that child is still there in the world, and your depression is still there, kicked off the bus, and you can shut the doors and drive away. But you're going to see your depression in the rearview mirror, and your depression is going to haunt you and it'll be following you. So you know what it's like when you feel depressed. You feel relieved when you don't feel depressed, but you also live in fear of the depression coming back.
mm, mhm,
Right. And the depression is going to be running down the road. This is the way I think about it. My depression will run down the road behind me and be hammering on the doors, when I stop at traffic lights. So, what are you going to do? You're better off keeping your depression on the bus.
mm,
And because otherwise depression, I mean, if I'm excluded from something, I want to get back in. So think about your depression as feeling isolated and lonely and excluded and hated and judged and criticized. Your depression will get depressed about that, right?
mm,
So think about your depression actually needing to feel welcomed and part of what it means to be a complex human being,
mm,
and keep the depression on the bus and look after your depression and nurture your depression, take care of your depression, and say, what do you need? Do you need to be looked after? Because actually, then the depression will feel safe and secure and feel understood. And it doesn't mean the depression doesn't sometimes hurt us or scare us, but actually, your depression will hurt and scare you less if you understand your depression. And it
mm,
also won't take over quite so much if you understand your depression. Give yourself permission to feel the depression and think, well, what's your message to me? What is it you want me to understand?
mm,
Because actually, there's reason to be depressed in the world. Maybe your depression is trying to get you. Now, I don't want to oversimplify this, and sometimes we do need other help to deal with things like depression and anxiety. And there are times that therapy, and in extreme, more strong cases, some medication for a short period of time can help, sure. But a lot can be done by changing our relationship with our emotions and by giving them permission to be part of our world.
mm,
Let's look at that diagram, Katie, that I know you like, that shows how all of the emotions relate to each other. So this curve can help us think about the usefulness of going down into the depression. Really, we talk about needing to grow up in the world, but actually what we also need to do is learn to grow down and
mm,
travel down into our feelings. So you might have been listening to me talk about depression and think, well, that's all very well, but it's still horrible and scary. And how do I benefit from that? Well, hopefully this will help us think about that. So we start on the far left hand side with the anxiety and that kind of activist mentality of happiness and external activism and determination and heroic belief. I'm going to change things. And power. We feel empowered. I can do something about this. Problem is we can often then realize this is bigger than I thought it was. We're not going to be able to save the planet all by ourselves. The activism has lots of bumps in the road and lots of obstacles, lots of dead ends, Lots of times you feel stuck, lots of times that you try to do things and it still fails, which is inevitable actually when it comes to resilience. Somebody asked me a few years back, how do you develop emotional resilience? And I said, oh, easy, you fail and you get stuck and you fall over and you give up and you feel hopeless. And then
Mm.
you get up and you try again. And if you read the narratives, read the stories of any activists like Greta Thunberg, everybody will talk about that, reaching that point of hopelessness
Mm.
and helplessness and powerlessness and thinking, I give up. I can't fight anymore. And it's crucial to reach that point. So this descent down through the fear, the threat, the guilt, the hopelessness to the depression, and the almost a kind of abandoning hope when you get to the bottom is absolutely crucial to build emotional resilience and to descend down into that despair and hopelessness and feel depressed and feel powerless. Now, I know that is counterintuitive. The problem is at that point, if you don't accept that journey down, that's what causes the burnout. The burnout happens when you get halfway down that curve and you think, no, I'm not going down there. I'm going to get up and force myself to keep fighting. So you try to reverse, right? Try to get back up to the, I can fight this. What happens? Think about yourself as being on a roller coaster and you get over the top of the roller coaster and halfway down and you put the brake on. You think, no, I'm not going down there. Okay, right. Just imagine what's going to happen. Can you reverse a roller coaster?
Mm.
No. You haven't got the energy to go backwards. You're not going to be able to put it into reverse. You have got the energy to put the brake on and stay still. And that's it. So you're not going to, so you're trying to reverse, you're burning yourself out, you're exhausted, you can't effect enough change because you can't reverse. You're stuck. And that's what causes the burnout. Burnout is often more about loss of meaning than loss of energy, emotional and physical energy. So you're halfway down in that threat position. That's where people burn out. Counterintuitively, the trick is to take the brake off and let yourself go down. Go down into the depression, into the despair, into the hopelessness and feel it. And paradoxically, the energy of letting yourself feel that and feel that giving up, lostness, starts to give you the energy to move towards a gradual acceptance. The alternative is that burnout, I'll make this work if it kills me, hostility at the bottom. Well, you're just trying to avoid the sadness and depression. Because what we have to come to terms with in any activist movement is repeated loss, repeated failure, repeated grief. We will lose over and over and over again. And that is part of the nature of what it means to fight, to be an activist, is to tolerate those losses and grieve them. And it's that grief and that wisdom that brings you to this gradual acceptance as you start going back up the other side. And that gradual acceptance is not a passive acceptance, not a, oh, well, what else can I do? No, it's a radical acceptance of accepting the depression, accepting the loss, accepting the grief, and finding a way to get your feet back under you and get yourself back up and move forwards again. And that radical acceptance says it accommodates both the determination and the despair, the hope and the hopelessness. It heals that binary split between the opposite emotions of fear and courage, of depression and the opposite of depression, which is optimism and hopefulness, right? When we heal the split between those emotions, we get this acceptance which is sustainable. And then you can see yourself in the future and then you can move forwards. and you can say to yourself, this can work and be good. But what you've got there is this healing between the split of the either or, it's good or it's bad. You're healing it and saying it's good and it's bad. It's both and.
Both and.
It's both and. And you can see that moving forwards on the far right hand side, you're at a higher level of functioning than when you went in. I don't want to just talk about functionality, because we have to keep in mind that being non-functional is important at times. But we also do want to be functional in the world externally. Of course we do, because that action that you talked about, Katie, feeling useful, feeling productive, feeling that you're making progress, you're doing stuff that's useful. Of course, that's valuable to us. That's that external activism. But what we've just been talking about is the importance of the internal activism. And internal activism is as important as the external. So if you could reframe it and say to yourself, if I'm feeling depressed, feeling hopeless, feeling stuck, this is valuable internal activism. And I need to allow myself to feel this and honor it and respect it. I might not like it. You don't have to like it, but you do need to respect it.
Wow.
And accept it.
I mean, let's say that again. Internal activism has so much value. And I suppose this is what people are doing now in their circles. And I think that's such an important point, because constantly I see this suggestion that to cure anxiety, eco-anxiety, you must take action. And what I've seen in so many youth movements in so many different spaces is that because of the urgency narrative of the crisis, people take action and they come into the movements 100 miles an hour. They're not balancing the external and the internal activism, and then they burn out. Because you're saying something different here. You're saying, well, first of all, feelings first, right?
Yeah.
Feelings first, and then you will move to an activism that feels sustainable. And then hopefully you'll move to something that feels like radical hope. And what is radical hope? Why does that differ from naive hope?
Radical hope is, well, we may be facing some of the worst things that humanity has ever faced, and we're going to go down fighting, and there's so much we can do, and there's still creativity and beauty and joy in the world, and there's despair and hopelessness. So you don't split off the emotions from each other and just try to live in one rather than the other. You don't get caught up in this split, one-sided, heroic narrative. You appreciate the fact that there's this other side of life. It's a bit like trying to live in the summer and never have the winter seasons. We need the winter seasons. Our plants need to go dormant. They need to die back. They need to rest. They need to be less productive. Just do it like a tree. Trees lose, deciduous trees lose their leaves in the winter here in the UK, because they need that seasonal rest. They need to be less productive. They need to go to sleep. They need to be dormant, and they need to wait for signs of spring. So be an activist like a deciduous tree in the UK. Allow yourself that winter period where you're just resting. You're not dead. You don't say a tree in the UK in the middle of winter is hopeless or pointless. You don't tell that tree that it's being lazy or pathetic and it's not doing anything. You don't attack the tree for the fact it needs a break, right? I just want to show you another thing about the resilience, which is this drawing.
This is great.
Which is the need for grit. So if you plant a seed in a plant pot where there's just soil, plant pot number one, your plant will grow fast, but it grows too fast, and the stem won't have any resilience. It'll be too straight. And when it's challenged by wind or just through growth, it'll collapse, it'll crash and burn. What we need is plant pot number two. The ideal growing medium for any seed of an idea or a desire or a wish or a plant or a campaign or activism is to have grit, little bits of grit in the soil. Because every time the root hits a piece of grit, it has to grow around it. And what you get is the same corresponding shape to the plant stems as you get to the root. So you get a wonky shape around the root, which has to grow around the grit. You get a wonky shape to your stem. And this is your resilient plant. So grit. So every obstacle, every emotion you don't know how to navigate, every problem, every person who is uncooperative, every problem that you face, whether it's emotional or practical or external, think of it as a piece of grit and think, right, how can we grow around this? How can this help build this resilient shape? What you don't want is plant pot number 3, where you're not growing around grit, you're growing around rocks. And people understandably may feel that the climate crisis, the climate and ecological crisis, is more like rocks than grit. And I would probably agree with you, if I'm honest, that it can feel that big, it can feel that overwhelming. And it can make growth really difficult and, make growth around these rocks exhausting for a plant. Think about what it's like to try and grow around that. What you need is a community to break down those rocks and really just break it down so you're not trying to grow around them on your own, right? Because otherwise you just get absolutely crushed and exhausted.
And what about if your rocks are too big, if they're systemic, if they're childhood trauma?
Well, a lot of them are. And it's partly that childhood trauma and that understanding of unfairness and injustice and cruelty and not being cared about and understood that motivates all of us to go into this work, because we know how it feels and we can be driven by that desire to right those wrongs. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. There's a construct called the wounded healer, that we're all here to try and heal in others what we've suffered in ourselves. You just need to have enough recovery in your own wounding and in your own oppression and in your own stuckness and your own trauma in order to be able to help others. So you might sometimes just need to get more help with that in order to help yourself to help others. That sense of wounding, I think, is invaluable, actually, because it helps us develop great empathy and understanding. It can be turned into wisdom. But you just don't want your wounds to be unpacked and messy, because then they can be triggered too often, and then it's really hard for you to look after yourself, let alone look after others. And that can happen. And if that happens, there's no shame in that. You just need extra support for yourself. And you need to just ask for additional support, because we can all get caught by thinking, oh, I thought I'd sorted this. And well, don't think you've sorted things, because things come back for a reason. And just say, don't judge, don't shame yourself. Just say to yourself, well, yeah, I just need some extra support here, and there's no shame in that, because that is part of that journey. And this
if you're watching and you feel like your rocks are too big and you need support, we have, as a resilience project, we have a support and signposting document, which we'll make sure that you'll have a copy of, which has some information on therapy, on how to find a therapist, on low-cost therapy particularly. And I know that the Climate Psychology Alliance, of which Caroline here is representing, offers 3 free sessions to young people.
The thing to keep in mind is around this is change and growth, because this is what it means to grow. Yeah, becoming an activist and getting involved in projects like the Resilience Project is growth: emotional, psychological, intellectual, cultural, spiritual, soulful growth. And growth always involves disruption. So change is not linear. Change, this is what we think change looks like, that we start here. I'm sorry, this is so shabby, but we start here with A and we think we're changing and we head to B. And then we think, so let's say, you've resolved your depression and you're on your journey and then you feel depression again. It's a huge mistake to think, oh no, I've gone backwards. Oh no, I've lost all my progress. To judge yourself and think this is a negative movement. This is wrong. This is completely wrong. This is what it really looks like. That change is cyclical. It is not linear. So you start here and you resolve to some extent your shame, your anxiety, your depression, your trauma, your hurt, your anger, your fear. And oh, look what's happening here. Oh, look, we've got anxiety again. We've got shame again. We've got depression again. We've got trauma again. Do you see? Just because you're feeling it again, it doesn't mean you're going backwards. It may mean you're going deeper. It's progression, not regression. But if you judge it as going backwards, you're not understanding that you are actually feeling these things at a deeper level every single time you go around this cycle. This is what the cycle of change and therapeutic recovery and healing looks like. So here's the other way to think about this. We talked about the masculine, non-gendered versus the feminine. And this is the way we split in Western society and countries that are dominated by the Western medical model and the Western construct of progress and strength and, achievement. We put all of those things up here into this box, this shape, this triangle.
Is that good?
So this is the good. So up here we put anything that we judge as good. People say, oh, we're non-judgmental. And then we judge everything. So we judge happiness, we judge joy, we judge beauty as good, right? The way we judge bodies, thin in the West, we talk about thin bodies being good, right? We talk about white skin as good. We place, this is a superior versus inferior model. And then we put anything that we want to view as inferior, such as depression, such as despair, such as hopelessness. We place it in the bottom half. So if we go there, we spend our whole life trying to get back up here and being told that we're wrong and this is bad. And we've got to work harder and beat the depression until we get back up here. This is a terrible model. This is one very big lie about what it means to be a human being. This is what we really need to work with. So we have the same splits, positive, negative, good, bad. There's nothing wrong with them. But we need to move between them so we have both. And we need to be able to have our depression and our happiness. We need to be able to have our despair and our hopelessness. And we move between them. And it's the energy. This fits with the model of the roller coaster. It's the energy. So we go to the despair. It's the energy of going there that will then bring us back to the positive feelings. And it's the energy of those that will then take us back to the more difficult feelings. And that constant motion of being able to move between them is what gives us psychological balance. And I kind of slightly laugh when I talk about psychological balance because we're none of us perfectly in balance, ever. We're constantly moving in and out of balance all the time. And it's that movement that is important and that understanding of both sides of life emotionally. It's important.
And I think that model and that distinction between the binariness of good and bad is so helpful for me and so helpful for the youth spaces that I move in, because there's this really strong narrative around what the perfect activist is and who the perfect activist is. And I know that my burnout, a couple of years ago, that was really triggered by my desire to be the perfect activist. And it just meant that I existed with so much guilt and shame when I did something that I could perceive as bad. And when you're trying to be perfect in an imperfect world, there is so much that is vilified, and the space for perfection gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And I see it everywhere, this idea of perfection and the guilt and the shame that it triggers. And I suppose that beautiful model of moving between the two,
Mm.
it really gives permission to celebrate being the bad activist from time to time,
Oh,
to
I
give
think you
yourself
should be
permission to stop.
a shockingly awful activist every
Yes.
single day in some way, shape, or form,
Mm,
even if it's a small thing. Addiction to perfection is lethal, it's dangerous. We're human beings. What it means to be a human being means to tolerate. Tolerate is not a good enough word. It means to love and embrace and dance with and play with our imperfections and to enjoy them because they're what connect us, they're what make us human. But the
mm,
reality is, and I think this is where we started about half an hour ago, is we can't get rid of these feelings, Katie, and we wish we could, but we can't.
mm,
So it's not as blunt as we have to learn to live with them or we have to make friends with them. You know, that's a little bit trite, but we do have to be in relationship with them and
mm,
accept that they're part of our lives. And our feelings, if we engage in this knowledgeable, aware, awake way around activism, will be more intense. Of course
mm,
they will. And if you get involved in, activism, you will feel more.
mm,
Don't be surprised, you won't feel less. But you can learn to tolerate those feelings, to treat those feelings as stepping stones, to visualize those feelings as helpers, wisdom, rather
mm.
than threats and enemies.
Yeah, and
You know?
to use them to compost your action,
Yeah,
use them as fertilizer to grow something.
yeah. And either way, feel proud that you're feeling them because I'm going to say it again. You're feeling this because you care.
Mm,
So you are spiritually, soulfully alive and aware and awake and caring about what's happening in the world.
mm,
And that in itself, you mustn't underestimate the input that that can have. Even if you can't see the external action, and this is one of the biggest problems, I think, is that we often can't see the impact of our external activism because it's small
mm,
and because we can feel tiny, and it's Greta Thunberg who says, no one's too small to not make a difference, right? It's like every small action helps, every small action is cumulative.
mm,
And, a lot of teaching stories throughout history have taught us about those small things. It's really about holding the tension with the hopelessness and the hope and the faith and the despair. And that those small things do make a difference. They do add up.
mm,
They're not enough on their own. We need them to be cumulative. We need them to be social. We need them to address the big public, global, political justice issues. Of course we do. But those small things are in relationship with those big things. So if you're unable to take on the big project today, do the small one today
mm,
and trust that the big one, somebody else can be looking after that until you can go back to it. Or those small things will, under the surface, be contributing to that cultural, emotional shift
mm,
taking place. And some of that shift takes place under the surface, and we can't always see it.
mm,
In the same way as you plant a bulb in the autumn, a daffodil bulb, And you then have to trust that it will grow under the surface throughout the winter and emerge in the spring. You
Mm.
don't plant your daffodil bulb and then keep digging it up every 5 minutes to see if it's grown roots, because you don't trust that it'll grow. You don't do that because it would kill it.
Caroline, I want to ask you some quick fire questions.
Perfect.
So the first quick fire question is a practical one. So walk me through an example. I'm feeling eco-anxiety. What do I do?
Okay, stop. So I'm also a diving instructor, and when people are in trouble underwater, we teach them a formula, which is stop, breathe, think, act. Because panic underwater will kill you, right? Not much else. Because actually, your training is good and you're hopefully there with buddies and people will help you, or you can get yourself out of trouble. But you've got to stop the panic. So stop, breathe, think, act. So I would add in feel for activism, for climate activism. Stop, breathe, feel, think, act. But once you have just paused and emotionally regulated yourself again through breathing, through connecting with emotion, through connecting with your thinking, then you can act wisely. And your action may be non action. Just wait. Yeah. Don't think of not doing anything as not being active. Sometimes you're not acting because it's not the right time to act. So you're acting by waiting. Yeah. So emotionally regulate before you do anything.
And what about the role of peer support? Could that be one of your actions? And why on earth are these resilience circles important?
Oh, they're crucial because, all human beings want is, to be heard, to be cared about, to be listened to be understood, and then we don't feel alone. One of the best definitions of mental illness I ever heard was mental illness consists of not being able to find anyone who can tolerate being with you. And it's that isolation which is the most painful and the most difficult and the most dysregulating and the most unbearable. And if somebody understands you where you're coming from, you're not on your own. And then you're not crazy, and it's shared. And somebody might not be able to fully 100% understand you, but they can understand your desire or your motivation or your distress or your care or your determination or your passion or your anger. So keep working on being understood and understanding other people. And so the circles, the resilience circles, are just so important because if one person in your circle doesn't get you, the next one will. Okay. And you also have to think about mirroring, that we learn who we are and we learn in relationship by being mirrored back from another person. And that's one-to-one relationships. We look into the other person and go, do you understand what I'm saying? I mean, am I making sense, Katie? And then you nod and I think, oh, phew, gosh, okay. And I don't feel so worried, right? Whereas if you go, you're not making any sense at all, I'm going to think, oh, okay, I need to try and say it differently. The beauty of the circle is you can sort of say this and you've got all of these mirrors back to you, with one person saying to you, I feel so much better because that's how I feel. And another person saying, I don't quite feel like that, but I feel like this. And I think what do you think? And then another person saying, I used to feel like that and now I feel this and it's different. You'll get all of these mirrored relationships back to you.
To bring us to a close, unfortunately,
Yeah.
I would like to just summarize a few of the key takeaways that we've both had from this conversation. So for me, I think the key takeaway is that eco-anxiety is not a mental health problem that needs to be fixed. It's a rational and a legitimate response to an emergency. And the big learning for me is that it's okay not to feel okay. It's actually really important sometimes to not feel okay because it shows that I am listening and that I care and that I am paying attention. And the final thing I'm taking away is that there is real value in leaning into difficult truths. That was what we experienced in session 1. And right now, in this moment, I cannot change those difficult truths. But what I can change is the support I have around me. And I can find communities where I feel seen, heard, and understood. And yes, things are really difficult, but they're a little bit less difficult, or they feel a bit less difficult when I'm in community where I feel like I am understood and I am heard.
And our souls don't grow without that difficulty. We don't develop wisdom without that struggle and that difficulty. So don't try and have a perfect problem-free life, because you will fail horribly and you will be trying to turn yourself into a robot. You'll be trying to be a human doing rather than a human being. Really, you just need to be a human being. And welcome to the human race, really, which is, we're not perfect, but we have extraordinary capacity for wisdom and humor and playfulness and creativity if we're open to that learning. And when all else fails, love, basically. We're doing this because we love the planet. We love the creatures on the planet. He's heard it all before. All about love.